This is the internet channel for the study of Hegel. And here is your host, Robert Vane.
Hi everyone, here is Robert Vane with yet another Hegel video. We are reading The Philosophy of Right, and we're going to dive into paragraph 44 in this video. Let me first explain to you a couple of things. I have a couple of introductory remarks. First of all, the question, why are we reading The Philosophy of Right in such detail? There are many questions that are connected with social philosophy in general, and we are, in a sense, postponing to ask those seemingly more important questions when we get to the later sections of the philosophy of right. Why not talk immediately about the injustice of property in the world, the division between the rich and the poor, and all of that stuff? Why aren't we talking about the economy? Why aren't we talking about the obscenity of wealth that we find in our Western world in so many places? Well, in general, you must say philosophy is the labor of the concept. It's hard work. It means going through the details of a concept and a philosophical system, not skipping something just to reach some interesting idea quicker than is possible or necessary. We need to have this temperament of the labor of the concept. That is, we need to have patience, and we need to focus on every step that we take in order to be sure that we eventually indeed reach our goal. Our goal is the true understanding of our social world, and we can only get to that when we take one step at a time. We can't just focus immediately on issues of equality and justice in the division of property or something like that, or the obscenity of wealth. Therefore, we have to work through it. I really don't care much about very general discussions about major principles in a fashion that is more journalistic than philosophical. Philosophy to me means this hard labor, and you find all sorts of discussions, very generalized discussions about the position of Hegel's philosophy within the realm of the history of philosophy, comparisons between his positions with the positions of others, and I find them to be barren and without any actual use. You need to go through the labor of the concept, and in order to do that, in this case, we need to go through every paragraph of the philosophy of right. We're not going to try and figure out just everything that is in there. We're not going to try and understand everything at first. That is not what I mean. But we need to get some kind of adequate grasp of every step along the way that Hegel is taking, and that is a necessary component of his philosophical position that is only expressed fully at the end of the philosophy of right. You cannot really understand the necessity of that outcome if you haven't gone through the steps before that. Okay, let's dive into the text then without further ado. I want to remind you, first of all, of some of the things that I've said before. We're going to talk today about paragraph 44, so we're going to talk about the topic of personality and property. In the previous video, I've talked about the concept of personality, the concept of person, and one of the texts that we read was paragraph 39. And I remind you that we found, let me just place myself somewhere else, we found this in paragraph 39. A person in his direct and definite individuality is related to a given external nature. Now, this given external nature makes the personality into something objective. That is the means by which it gives itself a confirmation of its existence within the outer world. The freedom of the person must be more than a assumption or a principle that we use, axiomatically use. We simply presuppose that there is something like freedom and we try to figure out where it occurs or where it is apparent, but then it's just a principle. Freedom of the person should be more than a purely inner quality of the subject. It's not a psychological category. But if that is the case, if freedom is more than principle or inner quality or assumption, then we need to find the self-confirmation of freedom in the realm of existence. It has to give itself an existence. Right is the existence of freedom, and the free will therefore has to give itself existence. Now, that is what is said here. Direct and definite individuality, that means the immediate form, the immediate and abstract form of individuality is related to a given external nature. Now, there is a contradiction in here. And the contradiction is that the personality now becomes opposed to the outer world as something subjective. Now, freedom or personality is supposed to be infinite and universal. Infinite because it has no boundaries, no limits, and universal because it has nothing outside of it. It's truly a universal. But when we say that freedom is mere subjectivity opposed to an objective world, we limit freedom. It's less than infinite. It has become finite, and it has a particular relationship to the objective world. So it's no longer universal. It's particularized. So that means that we can understand what Hegel is saying here. To confine to mere subjectivity the personality, which is meant to be infinite and universal, contradicts and destroys its nature. So we have this contradiction. Now, how does the free will try to overcome this limitation, this abstract self-contradiction? The person becomes an active subject that tries to remove this limitation, tries to sublate this relationship between itself as mere subjectivity and the outer world as purely given. Why can't the world be purely given? Because then, of course, freedom is something inner, an inner quality, and we are ruled actually not by our freedom, but by the necessities of this outer world. So we lose the whole concept of freedom if we accept this contradiction between our inner free subjectivity and the outer world that is dictated, that is ruled by laws of necessity. So we can't have that. We have to find the realization of the person within the outer world. Now, how does that work? We found that in paragraph 41. Paragraph 41 says, a person must give to his freedom an external sphere in order that he may reach the completeness of the idea. The idea, after all, means the full identity between thought and being, the full realization of the concept. If the concept is taken as something subjective, the full realization of the concept, the unity of the concept and its reality. So that was paragraph 41. When we consider freedom at this abstract level, it's both universal because everyone is a person in this sense, and it is abstract because we do not consider any specifics, any specific content. Let me just remind you that person was defined by Hegel as the individual free will that knows itself to be free will. The element of self-consciousness turns out to be quite important, as we will see in paragraph 44, with the discussion about animal rights. So self-consciousness of the free will is a vital part of this concept. Or in other words, in terms of the free will, a person is an individual free will that wants itself as free will. So person is the first abstract phase of the completely existent infinite will, and therefore this relationship to the outer world, to its existence, is at first a relationship to something that is purely external to it. It's not posited by the free will, but it's a given. So it's not only distinguishable from him, but directly different and separable. This directly, again, translates the word unmittelbar. So we talked about paragraph 42. That which is defined as different from the free spirit is both in its own nature and also for this spirit the external. It is an object, something not free, impersonal, and without rights. It's a Sache in German. So we have in Dutch the expression Zakenrecht. The sphere of the law that concerns itself with things that can be possessed and owned. We talked about paragraph 43, that this separate individual that is opposed to this objective given world is itself conceived to be purely natural. So that is also important. It has the same nature as the external world in a sense because it's defined itself as something simple and natural. Okay. Hegel discusses in the note here in 43 the issue of the property of, how would you say that in English? Well, it's about the legal possession of art, science, capacity to preach or read mass, and all of that stuff. So the immaterial objects. And Hegel's view is that the free will is capable of making into a thing, considering and treating something like a thing that has this inner spiritual side. And then he says the understanding becomes confused as how they are to be regarded at law. So we have here the special case of spiritual property rights. Moving on to paragraph 44 now. This is the paragraph I want to talk about now. And let's remind us first that the right to property is, in Hegel's philosophy, seen as the outcome of the principle of personality. So the principle of personality governs whatever we consider to be property. Now he says this: a person has the right to direct his will upon any object as his real and positive end. Let me take the German for a moment here, and let's see about this. The object thus becomes his, as it has no end in itself. It receives its meaning and soul from his will. Mankind has the absolute right to appropriate all that is a thing. So absolutes Zueignungsrecht des Menschen auf alle Sachen. Absolutes Zueignungsrecht. So it's the right to acquire and to take into your own possession whatever does not have this property of self-conscious free will, which does not have this universal and infinite nature, which is not truly spiritual in itself. A person has the right to direct his will upon any object. In German, in jede Sache ihren Willen zu legen. So to direct his will upon means to acquire it, to have your will, which is called in Latin animus. That is the intention of the person to own something. You have to have this animus. You can't stumble upon something and acquire it by accident. You have to want it, and you have to want it consciously and self-consciously. Not only that you want it, but you need to know that you want it. And you need to want it. All of that we have discussed before. So then the object becomes his. It becomes a property. It actually changes in essential quality. There's a huge difference between something that is not owned or cannot be owned and something that is owned. Something that is owned now becomes a vehicle for the self-expression of the person. This is mine means something like I am in there. I am expressed in whatever I am now in possession of. It has no end in itself. The thing has no substance, has no reality that is given to it by itself. Now, interestingly enough, Hegel says there are philosophies that see this differently. I'm not quite sure what he means by that. Which philosophy he means by that. There seems to be a reference to Kantian philosophy. There's also a philosophy which affirms that the mind cannot know what the truth or the thing in itself is. That would mean that, that's of course the Kantian position. That would mean that to take something into possession doesn't really affect the thing, because there is something like the thing in itself. So the only thing that is changed is the appearance or the relationship to the appearance that I have, but the thing itself remains itself. So if the thing in itself is not something that can be possessed because it has its own nature and end and purpose for whatever we can know, then of course property is with regard to the thing something quite superficial and external. But Hegel is saying that this external thing becomes part of my sphere of self-expression and thereby truly changes. It becomes something other than it was before it came into my possession. These philosophies, he says, are directly contradicted by the attitude of the free will to these things. So the philosophy that says that things have an independent and absolutely complete reality, and the philosophies that say that we cannot know what the thing in itself is, are wrong, because in the acquisition of property, we actually find a completely different thing happening. And that is that the thing does not have an independent reality. If it had an independent reality, it must have had some kind of opposition to my acquisition of it by stating its own purpose or withdrawing from my possession or whatever. There is no such activity in the thing that I possess. It should have an independent reality in consciousness as perceiving and imagining. And the free will is the idealization or truth of such reality. So the free will actually demonstrates in the process of acquisition that things do not have an independent reality, that their being is external to themselves. They do not have subjectivity. They do not have any kind of free will. So let's look at the addition now. A man may own anything because he is a free will and is therefore self-contained and self-dependent. But the mere object is of an opposite nature. So the object that I can own cannot be self-contained, cannot be self-dependent. Now, this is a way of talking about things that will immediately be in conformity with our own intuitions. When we look at books or tables or whatever, it's obvious that a book or a table does not have an independence of its own. It does not have self-containment and self-dependence. It is merely a thing. But how to talk about animals like that? An animal also is external to itself and is so far a thing. Now, is that really the case? In Hegel's era, the whole idea of self-consciousness in animals, for instance, in the great apes or in dolphins, was completely alien to biology at the time. But what we have found now is that animals, first of all, have a far greater sense of pain and impending death and all of that than we thought before. And secondly, they do have a kind of self-consciousness, as is demonstrated by the ability of the great apes to learn a language, a sign language, and talk about themselves up to a point. They can refer to themselves. And that is quite interesting, because then we can no longer say that all animals are external to themselves. Fish might be external to themselves, but these great apes seem to have properties and qualities that imply that they have self-consciousness. So in that sense, an ape or a dolphin cannot be owned. They can be subjugated, they can be brought into slavery, because that would be the most direct concept to use here. Now, Hegel says here, only the will is the unlimited and absolute, while all other things in contrast with the will are merely relative. And so this ability to acquire things, to take things into ownership, is so powerful and so universal that all things, including animals, even if you have to do quite a lot to really own a horse, for instance, and you cannot really own wild animals, only in the sense that you can lock them up in cages, but yet you can see them as expressions of your personality, and no one will dispute your right to own animals unless there is regulations for that, for whatever reason. But that's something that belongs to civil society and its laws. Basically, it's about the capacity to take an animal into possession, not about the propriety of that kind of acquisition, or about the proper behavior towards animals that are in your possession. That's all something that should be found somewhere else in the realm of law and right. To appropriate is at bottom only to manifest the majesty of my will towards things by demonstrating that they are not self-complete and have no purpose of their own. They get a purpose. By becoming my property. This is brought about by my instilling into the object another end than that which it primarily had. Now, did it have any end at all before I took it into my possession? Now, you might say that the animal had the end or the purpose just to propagate its species, and when it comes into my possession, I use the horse, for instance, for racing purposes, and then it has as its purpose to earn me money. So in that sense, the object gets another end than that which it primarily had. When the living thing becomes my property, it gets another soul than it had. I gave it my will. The horse will obey my orders, will obey my will. And in that sense, it has another soul than it had. It's no longer a free animal. It's no longer a wild animal. It's now an animal that has to obey my purposes for it. Free will is thus the idealism which refuses to hold that things as they are can be self-complete. So free will is an expression of that idealism, because it destroys the possibility of some kind of absolute realism, which is the first philosophy we encountered here in the note, the philosophy that ascribes to the impersonal, to separate things, an independent and absolutely complete reality. That's kind of an absolute realism. And Hegel says the free will is the contradiction to that, is the refutation of that. Things cannot be self-complete. So he is saying an animal like a horse cannot be self-complete. Merely because we have the ability to subjugate an animal, does that imply that that animal is not self-complete? Remember the argument for slavery, that it was the right of the white race to subjugate other races simply because they could easily be defeated in battle, because they did not have the same kind of society that we had, because they were not Christian. Therefore, they were not on the same level, they were not civilized, etc. So they were not complete. They were not self-complete. Their cultures were of indifference to us. Now, that argument for slavery was rightfully rejected as soon as we came to understand that there can be many kinds of human cultures, and that there is more universality in these cultures than that there are particular differences. So other races have the same kind of humanity as we have, and it's not a difference between humanity and pseudo-humanity, it's a difference between different human cultures more than anything. So the argument that an animal cannot be self-complete rests entirely on the fact that we impose this criterion of self-consciousness and expression of free will and language and all of that as part of the concept of the dignity of personality. Now, of course, realism, on the other hand, that declares them to be absolute in their finite form, cannot be followed here. This realistic philosophy is not shared in by the animal, which by consuming things proves that they are not absolutely independent. Well, they also prove that there are living things, and that they therefore have some kind of will. And the question then becomes, do they have free will? Have they the ability to choose? Remember, in the Middle Ages, it was considered to be not a property of animals to be able to choose. They were simply led by their instincts and external impulses. And that led to the ass of Buridan, the ass that is exactly in between two stacks of hay, and it has to choose between the two, but it cannot if it were to be purely rational. But of course, it is not rational. It does not have a rational free will, so it will consume first the one and then the other. But the idea was that an ass was not a rational being, and therefore didn't have this problem of free choice. Does an animal have free will? I believe that at present, animals like dolphins and the great apes, we cannot deny them the property of free will. So in a sense, we cannot deny them, if personality is defined by all of this, we cannot deny them the status or the status of personality. On the other hand, if personality naturally flows into something like property, we can ask the question whether these animals that we just have declared to be persons, if they are owners, and if they're not owners, their personality is not the same as ours. It's different. They are personalities without this urge to ownership. That leads to two questions that cannot be resolved right now, but I want to ask these questions just to focus you on the problems that we have just arrived at. One is, if animals do have free will, some animals do have free will, and yet their free will is not expressed in property, then in what sense should we say that free will is necessarily expressed in property? That's one thing. And the other thing is, if free will is not only expressed in the acquisition of property, then the notion that some animals have free will and therefore have personality should extend to include something like animal rights, the right of an individual animal to be treated far better than just as a thing that can be possessed. So these are interesting questions concerning Hegel's philosophy within the context of the current discussion about animal rights and the ability of some animals to experience pain in a manner that is more equal to our own, and secondly, to have this property of self-consciousness. Okay, let me conclude just with two statements. Let me make three final remarks. First of all, this concept of property is not an ideological foundation for any kind of ruling class, the class of the owners, and it cannot be seen like that. It has a critical function because it states that no one may be treated as slave or as a thing. Now, we might think that slavery is gone, but there is such a thing as slavery as soon as you take someone captive because he has no other means of survival or living and satisfy his needs than by doing your bidding, to be obedient to you. So if there is no alternative to become a property of some kind of industry or company in order to survive, that in fact constitutes, in Hegel's view, slavery. It means that you are treated like a slave or a thing. So we don't have that. We have this critical idea that you cannot be treated as slave or a thing. And as I said before, this might extend to some animals, and it raises the question of animal rights because of what we have found out since Hegel of the property of animals to be much more sentient and much more self-aware than we considered earlier. And it raises the question again whether or not this free will is only expressed in the form of the ability to acquire property, or that this acquisition of property should be widened, or let's say restricted to human beings, and should be widened to include other forms of the expression of free will. Thirdly, this whole concept of property, as Hegel explains explicitly, is not does not involve immediately our needs. So property is not about needs. Possession is about needs. Consumption is about needs. But property shows a quality of human beings that goes beyond, let's say, the organization of our needs. It goes beyond economics. We live in an era, I think, that makes economic issues and my existence as an economic being, trying to survive, organizing a household, being part of the market and selling my labor and all of that, that considers that economical status of my personality to be the highest that there can be. It considers humans in their rank by considering the measure of success that they have in that economic sphere. For Hegel, here it becomes obvious that property is not about satisfying my needs, and not even about expressing myself as becoming a person that is above his needs, that has more than he needs, that has wealth in such a degree that it can easily satisfy its own needs and becomes essential and necessary for others to satisfy their needs. Economy and the economical way of thinking about ourselves as a society and as persons is absolutely vital, but it's only a first stage of the purpose that is the purpose of our social organization, of our society. As Hegel will show in his social philosophy, in his philosophy of right, beyond the whole sphere of economy and law and government is the sphere of art, religion, and philosophy itself, let's say, including science. And all of these endeavors of humanity go above and beyond the sphere of property, morality, and economy.
Podcast devoted to the study of Hegel's philosophy of right.